Before we begin, I remind witnesses that the Senate has resolved that an officer of the Department of the Commonwealth shall not be asked to give opinions on matters of policy and should be given a reasonable opportunity to refer questions asked of the officer to superior officers or to a minister. This resolution prohibits only questions asking for opinions on matters of policy, does not preclude questions asking for explanations of policies or factual questions about when and how policies were adopted. I particularly draw the attention of officers to an order of the Senate of the 13th of May 2009 specifying the process by which a claim of public interest immunity should be raised. Copies are available from the Secretariat. And now for the Hansard record, could you each please state your full name and the capacity in which you appear today? Who wants to start?
Chair, thanks very much for the opportunity. AIRMSHL Leigh Davies, Chief of Air Force. Chair, we, as an Air Force, as an ADF, have operated a fighter force and ability to...
Sorry, we're just going to get introductions at this stage for Hansard. So name and what? The Hansard record, please state your full name and the capacity in which you appear today.
AIRMSHL Leigh Davies, Chief of Air Force.
Air Vice Marshal Lee Gordon, incoming Head of JSF.
Air Vice Marshal Deeble, retired, the outgoing Program Manager for JSF.
Gillis, Deputy Secretary, Capability Acquisition and Sustainment Group.
Todd, Mansell, Acting Chief Defence Scientist.
Thank you. Now, if you'd like to make an opening statement, proceed.
Thanks, Chair. Chair, Air Force has operated the fighter force and the ability to conduct control of the air since pretty much our inception. We will be retiring our classic Hornet fleet in the early 20s, and we have gone through a process, of course, of determining the best replacement aircraft type for the classic Hornet. And in Air Force's view, in my view, the Joint Strike Fighter represents the best and the only option for a replacement of classic Hornet. We still remain comfortable with the program, with the level of engagement and with the progress of the Joint Strike Fighter program. And at this point, I have no concerns that would have me come to a conclusion that the transition from Classic Hornet to JSF will not occur on time.
Thank you. No other statements?
Kim Gillis, Deputy Secretary, Capability Acquisition and Sustainment. At this stage where I have Air Vice Marshal Deeble, who's just indicated that he's just recently retired from the Air Force. He's now moved to a role in Air Services. But as that only happened in the last couple of days, we thought it appropriate that as he's been the Joint Strike Fighter lead for the last 2 years, and as Air Vice Marshal Deeble has only had 2 days in the role, that the best representation that we could provide you would be the Air Vice Marshal. So over to the Air Vice Marshal.
Thank you, Chair. I've been a RAF officer for 37 years, 2 days into my retirement. I've had the great privilege of running a range of very complex programs for the Defence Material and now CASG over a number of years, the AWC program, Collins-class submarine, a short tour on the multi-role tanker transport, and more recently the JSF. JSF is clearly one of the largest programs out there that I've ever run and has a great degree of complexity from a number of perspectives. Lieutenant General Chris Bogdan recently made the comment that after more than 25 years of acquisition experience, he has not seen a program where the perceptions are so far removed from the reality. I think I would share his view in many respects. However, the Australian program is arguably the most complex global defence acquisition program, I'm talking about in the broader context, in history. So it has a large amount of global and technology and programmatic risk associated with it. I think these risks have been incrementally addressed over time. That is not to say that there aren't issues that we will face as we move forward. The measure of a mature program is the ability to find these issues and to actually resolve them in a safe and appropriate and timely manner. I think this is the case for the JSF program, and I will happily address any of the specific issues that come out of the DOT&E report or others in that regard. I think the progress the program is making progress as per the approval in the April 14 timeframe, and we still sit within the cost schedule parameters that were set at that time.
Okay, thank you. If I might start with a couple of questions. What or were there any alternatives to the F-35 considered, and if so, why were they deemed less suitable than the F-35? Is there a short answer to that?
Yeah, Chair, when the Air 6000 project began, there were a number of aircraft considered as the Classic Hornet replacement, and there were also a number of scenarios considered, if you like, for a does it have to be a certain number of aircraft or a certain type? What if there was a mix of those? What if we had an increased ground-based air defence system? What if we had a more robust missile defence system? What if we had more air warfare destroyers? If we had a different posture? Each time we did those scenario run-throughs, it kept coming back to the need for, at that time, a manned fighter aircraft. As we went through the types of aircraft that we would consider at the time, there were a number of factors like range, like ability to expand into the future the capabilities of the systems on board, and as those were considered, different aircraft, or aircraft other than the Joint Strike Fighter, became less able to meet those requirements of the future.
What level of confidence do you have about the successful completion of the F-35 development?
We have significant confidence in the program to meet an Australian delivery schedule. The timeline that we are currently working to, which is delivering aeroplanes at the back end of 18, but looking for an IOC in 2020, gives us 4 years of continued development and appreciation for the current vector of development, and that gives us confidence that we can meet that 2020 timeline.
So is there a risk that delays in the development of the F-35 could leave Australia with a capability gap? Is there a risk of that at all, given the timelines you've mentioned?
Not in my view, Chair. The ability to operate the aeroplane now by our 2 pilots and 2 more under training at Luke Air Force Base gives me considerable confidence that their appreciation of the aircraft that is immature, given the context of the aeroplane we will receive at initial operating capability timeline. The aeroplane right now has significant advantages in its operations over the F-18. So as we build over the next 4 years, my level of confidence remains high.
Now, just to go to a bit of detail about where you get that confidence from, how many Australian Defence officials are in the Joint Program Office and in what roles?
We currently have approximately 20 representatives operating within the Joint Program Office at the moment. That number does vary over time, and we're at the point of actually revisiting that as the JPO goes through a reorganisation associated with moving into the sustainment phase. We do have, and I would like to state that we do have personnel invested in the test and evaluation program and have
Sorry,
had
we're
so.
going to go on to that.
Yeah.
So the Joint Program Office, what roles are they?
They're in a range of roles relating to technical through to commercial, in the cost areas, also in a number of the different support areas such as the ALICE team and otherwise, and we currently head up the ALICE team.
So they all feed into the command's view of confidence and...
They are embedded, so they support the JPO in their efforts, and they also provide feedback to us on issues that relate to the Australian program as they see them.
So how many Australian Defence officials are involved in the F-35 test and evaluation program?
We had 2 personnel invested since 2010. That followed the approval of the program for the Stage 1, first 14 aircraft in 2009. They supported the DT program. We currently have 4 personnel supporting the JOT, which is the Joint Operational Test Team, operating out of Eglin Air Force Base. And those bodies include test pilot, a test engineer, and 2 personnel that are specifically looking at the suitability of the capability and all the support systems.
Are there any Australian Defence officials at the F-35 manufacturing facility, and if so, what roles do they have?
We have 2 personnel operating at Lockheed Martin Fort Worth. One of those is an engineer supporting the Lightning support team, so he is in an engineering role and supporting that the aircraft there. And we also have a logistics personnel looking at the global supply chain and other elements.
Are there any Australian Defence officials working on US F-35 bases, and if so, in what roles do they?
So we currently have 2 pilots operating at Luke Air Force Base and 1 engineer. The engineer is a maintenance engineer, so he's working on the flight line in the squadron that supports our aircraft, and we have 2 pilots operating with the training capability at Luke Air Force Base.
So would it be, could I characterise your evidence is that you have embedded in the program enough experienced, trained personnel to give you the expertise to draw on this view that things are not going badly?
My professional view is that we have significant embedded bodies that gain significant insight to the program and have an opportunity to provide, while they work within those environments, have opportunities of providing information back to us.
How much has Australia expended on the F-35 to date?
Rough order, because it is changing as we're talking. We're signing contracts on a regular basis. We've expended over $1 billion on the program. That includes the early MOU payments and the 2 stages of the project that has been approved to date by government.
What percentage does this represent of the overall program budget?
The current budget, and understanding that this has gone through a couple of exchange rate updates, is $17.1 billion.
7.1.
$17.1 billion.
Okay.
$2.6 billion of that is contingency.
So how does this Australian spend profile compare with the spend profile on a standalone aircraft development programs funded by Australia? So presumably there are benefits from the collaborative model that we're in at the moment.
I think there are a number of significant benefits. Gaining the insight into the evolution of the capability, understanding that it is a technically complex capability, so we get to understand that. We get to understand and have insight into the operation of the aircraft in the States beforehand. We have our aircrew involved in the training system, so they get to understand the training system early in the piece. I think there's also early engagement in the program, as you heard before, has had significant industry benefits, $554.5 million to date, US dollars, in contracts actually signed. I believe that there is potential for at least $2 billion US by about the 2023 time, and potentially $4 billion around the end of the current end of the production in about 2035. You would note that I have reasonable confidence in that based on the long lead and the long-term agreements that have been struck with industry that would be over $2 billion in their own right, as you heard earlier today.
Okay, and just finally, before I go to other senators, environmentally, there's been a bit of concern about noise. Can you explain its assessment of the impact of the F-35 on the environment around its main operating bases? I think it's Williamtown and Tyndall's probably not so much of a problem. So will the F-35 perform more or less afterburner takeoffs from the FA-18? Give us a snapshot of that, please.
Chair, the Joint Strike Fighter, the engine design, the size and the thrust of the engine does give it the maximum afterburner potential and to be noisier than the Hornet. The delta that we have taken into account and are planning for is that the use of afterburner by the Joint Strike Fighter will be considerably less, and in simple terms, the vast majority of the takeoffs at Williamtown, at Amberley, at Tyndall will not require afterburner. when we combine then the power required for the takeoff and the profile that the Joint Strike Fighter will fly, it has not altered in a noise sense the noise measurements or the noise exposure forecast that we have completed for Williamtown and our other JSF operating bases by very much, and in some situations has reduced the incidence of noise for those folk on the ground that would be affected.
So no appreciable increase in noise pollution?
The ANEF takes into account the average noise, the number of movements and the level of noise, and in an ANEF context that is correct. However, I'm not saying that the JSF will never be noisier on a single takeoff or a single profile on a particular time on a particular day. The JSF in pure DB at full afterburner is noisier than a classic Hornet and a Super Hornet.
Okay, thank you. Senator Xenophon, do you want to commence?
I do. I just want to go to a number of issues in respect of capability and cost. If I can just go to the Defence Capability and Investment Committee's report back in 2002, the Investment Analysis Branch of March 2002, that was looking at Australian participation in the US Joint Strike Fighter Program, System Development and Demonstration Phase. The decision made at paragraph 45, in part 45A, said the DCIC might agree that sole sourcing JSF or Air 6000 now is not appropriate because of concerns about capability, cost and schedule issues of the JSF project. Secondly, subparagraph B, agree that participation in the system development and demonstration phase of the Joint Strike Fighter project is not recommended at this time. Then there were two other recommendations made about Lockheed Martin's surveying of Australian industry and input. I just want to put that fairly. Now, that is the most senior Defence Committee that makes these decisions, isn't it, in terms of investment? Correct? Somebody help me with that.
Yes, the Defence Capability and Investment Committee is the senior Defence Committee before leaving Defence to come to government consideration, yes.
So this is a very senior committee of people with significant expertise.
Correct.
And I emphasise that this is a declassified document that I have. Now, about 3 months later, the government signed up to the F-35 program. Can anyone on the panel tell me what happened from the most senior committee saying let's not go ahead with this, and 3 months later the Commonwealth government at the time signed up for this program? I'm just trying to see, did the things sorted out? Were concerns allayed? Was there another report from...
Senator Kim Gillis, Deputy Secretary KSG. That's a matter of 13 years ago. None of us were in a position, I don't think,
14 years ago.
14 years ago. It's a very long time ago. I don't think it's a reasonable thing for us to be answering at this stage about what a decision was that was made at that stage. We can take that on notice, but I don't have that data with me.
Well, could you please take on notice, firstly, that was a decision made by Defence Capability and Investment Committee. It's addendum number 8/2002. Happy to provide a copy of the document, but I think it's something you'd be able to source.
Just ask something at this point, or make a point. It actually is very important in the context of the inquiry today, because we heard the Canadian situation is they're doing a full review, a cost-benefit analysis now, late in this stage, and it has been suggested that this hasn't been done in the Department of Defence at this time. So we'll come back to that later, but it actually is quite important in the context of what the committee needs to consider.
So if I, through you, Chair, if I may just establish on notice, if you can establish on notice the decisions made by the DCIC and up until the point when the Commonwealth Government made a decision about 3 months later to participate in the program, whether there was any subsequent advice from Defence, and in particular the DCIC, in respect of that. In other words, if there was a change of view on the behalf of, I want to be fair to Defence, if there was a change of view on behalf of DCIC, what led to that and what material was put before Defence in respect to that, and if there wasn't a change in respect of that, whether there was any subsequent advice between the DCIC, the Investment Analysis Branch of March 2002, as to why the government did what it did, whether there are any other factors. In other words, were the experts in defence ignored in respect of this? I don't think it's an unreasonable question, given it may have been a long time ago, but I think I'm just trying to understand.
And Senator, we'll have to take that on notice just because of the time that's lapsed in between that and now.
You were in defence then, Mr. Gillis?
No, I wasn't.
Really? No, I'm not saying you should have been.
No, I think I was working for probably Austral ships at that stage.
Okay. All right. So we'll deal with that. I have some other questions in terms of Dr. Gilmore's criticisms of the program, and I think one of our witnesses early today, Dr. Joyner. I think, in answer to a question I put to him, he considered that in the scheme of things that Dr. Gilmore is God when it comes to these sorts of projects, and that he's the person that Defence ought to be looking to here in Australia if there are any queries or questions about the program. I mean, how do you see? I'm not suggesting that you equate Dr. Gilmore to God, and that might be sacrilegious or is sacrilegious, but how does it... Mr. Gillis, are you saying that he is God or is sacrilegious?
I think, Senator, I was going with the sacrilegious part.
Yeah, okay.
Senator, I meet with Dr. Gilmore just about every time I go to Washington.
Right.
And I have a pretty good understanding of where he sits in the equation. He is... I don't think he would like to be called God, and he does provide independent advice to the Office of the Secretary of Defence.
He's well regarded and credible, is that fair?
I think it is, and his evidence, what he provides, is based on the data that's provided by Lockheed Martin, Pratt & Whitney and the Joint Program Office, so he is looking at that data and interpreting it. I think the point that's been made earlier, though, is he often doesn't draw conclusions or doesn't make statements around the work that's being done to address those issues, and many, if not all of those issues, are being worked as we speak.
But at the time he prepared the report...
It's accurate. It reflects the issues at that point in time.
Right. And to what extent does that set off alarm bells in terms of defence and your role?
We're aware of those issues because we're engaged in the program, as was mentioned before to the Chair. So there's no surprises in there, I think, from either a Lockheed Martin or a Joint Program Office or a partner perspective, because we have the visibility of the issues as they arise, and we're aware of the work that's being done to rectify those issues. So I think that we have a view that Dr. Gilmore clearly states that. He holds everybody accountable in that regard. We wouldn't always agree with some of his conclusions and how he might draw forward what the outcomes might be, because we have a different perspective. But he actually accurately states what has occurred at that point in time.
I just want to race through a few issues, because I know my other colleagues have questions, and I'm just concerned about time constraints. I'll try and be as quick as I can through you, Chair. In terms of the confidence, I think that Marshal Davies, you said that there's a high level of confidence, or words to that effect, about the program.
Yes.
I asked Lockheed Martin questions about issues of liquidated damages, that if there's a failure to perform, there'll be liquidated damages. It's not uncommon in contracts. Is it your understanding that Defence, and Mr. Gillis might be able to help me with this, that there are circumstances where, I'm not talking about the F-35s, but I'm talking about other programs where liquidated damages can be triggered in the event that there's a non-performance of the contract. Is that right?
It depends on the nature of the contract.
But it does exist in
Yes, it does.
Okay. Putting my old suburban lawyer's hat on, my understanding is that if a company is prepared to go along with liquidated damages, it indicates a high level, that punishment if they don't perform.
It's not, it's a pre-agreed set of numbers if in fact something doesn't happen relative to performance or with schedule or things. So it's the nature of liquidated damages is that you actually you strike an agreement before as you enter into contract.
But usually my understanding of liquidated damages is that there's usually the party that's supposed to perform the contract, that's getting paid for the contract, usually has a fair degree of confidence that they'll be able to comply, that they'll be able to fulfil the conditions so that they won't get slugged with liquidated damages clauses. It's one of those, it's kind of a sort of Damocles hanging over the head.
Companies, when they enter contracts, do a risk assessment against the risk profile, make a decision, make commercial decisions about what liquidated damage. That's why it's an agreed position before you go into a contract.
And doesn't it then follow, logically, that if a company is not prepared or there is no agreement as to liquidated damages, one of the arguments put forward to that is that maybe the risk assessment is that there is a high level of risk in this project and therefore agreeing to a liquidated damages clause could be quite problematic. I mean,
that could be one interpretation as to why.
It's not an unreasonable interpretation, though, is it?
No, it's not unreasonable, but it's one interpretation.
Okay. So, but in terms of, can I just ask in terms of acquisition costs, is there a concession that Defence hasn't done well over time with respect to estimating the cost for this program, that it keeps blowing out?
Senator, I believe that up until the point that the program was rebaselined, it had a non-McCurdy breach. That non-McCurdy breach was associated with increased costs associated with the program. And as per the normal thing, it was a critical breach, so it exceeded those costs by 50%. I do have the data there that if you require that. At that point in time, there was clearly an underestimation of the costs and the risks associated with the program. As a consequence of that, the program was rebaselined in 2012, and since 2012 we've maintained within those cost parameters that were set. So there hasn't been an increase in that point in time, and I think that reflects a much more reasoned and reasonable plan for moving forward. Prior to that,
it's a bit like revaluing a currency. In the bad old days, some countries would just revalue their currency in order to try and rebaseline things. It's a bit like that, isn't it?
No, I don't think so in this case, because effectively there was additional money injected into the program to address those risks and to take account of the additional time associated with it. At that point in time, it was another 5 years. There needed to be another 5 years' worth of...
But as a relatively junior partner in the program, you don't really have any control over the cost, do you?
We have influence around those things and highlight when that would be significant to us, as a nation. So I think we do. And as a partner, we have a voice at the table.
We have a voice, but to the extent it's acted upon, by virtue of the size of our order compared to the whole program. Just very quickly.
Effectively what you're saying is clearly the US, 2,443 aircraft, for the US services.
Sure.
They have a lot more power in that game, and they are the lead in this program. The US is leading the program.
Understood. So the projected acquisition costs for a total of the 72 F-35s, do we know what that is at this stage? Is that a matter of public record?
I could talk about that in a number of different dimensions. So I mentioned before that our current Stage 1 and Stage 2, so that's the full 72 aircraft, our current budget is $17.1 billion. $2.6 billion of that is a contingency. So that effectively leaves you with about $14.5 billion associated with the purchase of the 72 aircraft, the support equipment and the infrastructure.
But not sustainment?
No, not including sustainment. It does include spares and other elements.
Sure. What's sustainment's likely to be a 2-to-1 ratio of acquisition costs?
Those rules of thumb, somewhere for complex capabilities, it's normally 2 to 2.5 times the cost of the acquisition would roughly relate to that. We're currently estimating that the sustainment costs, through life sustainment costs, will be $43 billion. We had agreement when we went to second pass for the 58 aircraft that we would only get funding, some $4 billion, out to the FY 24-25 time frame, and that we have to go back after 2020 to actually give more updated estimates of the cost of sustainment for through life.
And can I just ask, can I wrap up in a sec? So does that cost include access to IP sufficient for Australia to not be reliant on the US for ongoing sustainment?
Elements of the production sustainment follow-on development MOU include the access to the IP and the technical data required to maintain and operate the aircraft here.
But not access to the source code, though?
Not access to the source code.
Right. And just finally for now, in case, if there is any time, you're familiar with the Air Power Australia comparison, the table that I put to other witnesses today, and I think it's been discussed. There's no great secret about it. Have you had a chance to observe, to look at it, and tell me whether you agree or disagree with it? Presumably you disagree with it. Are you able to, if you can't tell me now, can you at least on notice tell me where there is a disagreement between Defence and Air Force and the 0-1 comparative techniques table prepared by Air Power Australia?
A lot of the Air Marshal Leigh Davies, Chief Air Force, the table is not accurate in some elements, Senator, and I'm quite comfortable to go through those in slower time with you.
Or the committee. I mean, I'm happy for you to provide it on notice, if that's okay.
And that on notice, we'll take that on notice. There are elements of the table that need to be cognizant of many aspects of the aircraft and its systems that have evolved, and many of them which are classified.
All right, and there's some other matters that were raised in a Washington Post article of February of last month that if we have time, I might go to them or put them on notice. Thank you, Chair.
Okay, we'll go to Senator Fawcett then for about 12 minutes or thereabouts, and then capture Senator Wishfulston, and then we'll have a round the table wrap up.
Okay, well, can I just start off, AVM Deeble, by saying thank you for your service over many years. I've had involvement with many of the projects you've been involved with, and you've added significant value. So thank you, and all the best with your new role.
Thank you very much.
More broadly, can I just start off with a comment, CAF perhaps, and to Kaz G, Mr Gillis, about reporting by Defence to committees in the Parliament. I think I've raised this once before about the fact that we like to see transparency, and I've got to say there are still some parts in this report that look as though they've been lifted from Lockheed Martin's glossy brochures. Paragraph 53 in particular talks about the F-35 characteristics of lethality, survivability, affordability and supportability are the hallmarks of fifth generation capability and what sets the F-35 apart from legacy platforms. The lethality hasn't been proven. We've just been talking about VSIM and the lack of fidelity there. We don't yet know about survivability, affordability and supportability. You go on in paragraph 72, thankfully later, to highlight the fact that there's quite a few unknowns. You won't actually know the through-life support cost until after 2020. And I guess just as a general comment about tone, there'd be a lot more confidence about Defence as a smart buyer if paragraphs like that were written in the context of the claim is, or it is promised or expected or whatever, as opposed to a statement of fact, because there are very few facts that would appear that at the moment substantiate that. It's a promise, it's what you clearly expect, but it's not yet substantiated.
Senator Fawcett, I think that's a fair statement in respect to that particular one. I'll take that on notice, and we will improve that process.
Sure, no, that would be great. Can I take you to paragraph 77? You're talking there about IOC for Australia, and you're saying the schedule is going to be challenging to establish the required support. Could you just articulate a little more the aspects that are going to be particularly challenging and what you're doing to lean forward to address those?
Senator, I think if you read the major projects report for JSF, you will see that we're actually showing that there is some risk as we move forward to the first aircraft arrival at the end of 2018 and also the initial operational capability at 2020. We don't see the aircraft as being the issue because we do have some margin for the software and those aircraft systems to still evolve. Where the majority of the risks are is in the training system. In particular, for maintenance, training represents a risk as we're moving forward. And for us to have the initial cadre of maintenance personnel available here to support those aircraft when they arrive, we're having to do some risk mitigation in terms of how we get those personnel trained and experienced on the aircraft to be able to conduct those initial operations back here in Australia, and also to be able to conduct from the start of 2019 maintenance training at our training centre at RAF Base Williamtown. So that's one area of concern. We are concerned about Alice. It hasn't evolved. I think the DOT&E reports highlights the sorts of issues with the maturity of the Alice software. We are concerned about what that means in terms of integrating that system into Australia, including the areas of cyber and whether or not it's got the appropriate protections involved, and it will be about how we integrate ALICE into the Australian Defence Information environment so that we can then correctly support the aircraft when it gets back here. We're actively engaged in ALICE, as I mentioned before. We have one of our personnel acting as the head of that ALICE area, so we are having some influence in the way in which ALICE will go into the future, at least while we're in that key position for the immediate future. And we see that we need to get a greater understanding of the ALICE system and understand what that means for Australia and the potential for us to have to use legacy systems in support of the aircraft rather than being able to use the full functionality that exists in ALICE. So that's an area that is of concern for us. Reprogramming, and I'd need, just for the committee, I'd need to make it clear there's a couple of areas where you can use the word reprogramming and it will be misinterpreted. I'm not talking about reprogramming the software, that is where the functionality sits in the aircraft. I'm talking about the ability to reprogram it with the information that's required to conduct each mission. We are setting up a collaborative facility at Eglin Air Force Base with the Canadians and the UK predominantly at the moment. Canada's yet to fully commit to it, which will be our reprogramming capability for the aircraft. I think it is true to say that reprogramming across the JSF enterprise is evolving as we speak. So the ability to get a reprogramming, a mission data file that we will take to the aircraft that will do everything we need it to do when the aircraft first arrived back here in Australia is going to be a concern, and we're working through those risks as we speak about what are we going to get, how good is it going to be, is that going to be capable of supporting our operational test and evaluation. And we're looking at a range of risk mitigation with the US at the moment to be able to address that specific risk. I think the area of VSIM. VSIM is not just about test and evaluation, it is also about high fidelity training in the full mission simulators that we have for the aircraft. The real issue, and it is correct to say that Lockheed Martin haven't lost all of the contract, they're still responsible for refining the aircraft model that is fundamental to VSIM. The work that has gone to the US Navy is the work associated with the Joint Synthetic Environment. It's effectively where the threats get represented appropriately. That work is going to US Navy, but the two will have to come back together. We hope to leverage that. While the aircraft has the simulator has high fidelity for the conduct of ab initio training, which is fundamental, to a single-placed aircraft. You need to train your pilot well in a simulator before you take him into the aircraft. We are concerned about being able to do mission rehearsal, which requires a much higher fidelity. And we hope to leverage the work that is done in that joint synthetic environment and the work that's been done with Lockheed Martin to refine their aircraft model to get that back into the full mission simulator to improve the level and the nature of training that we can conduct. So you can see a lot of those areas there are about the maturity of the systems that we will have to be using here in Australia to support the aircraft. The other area that is a concern that I have raised in, again, our submission was the area of understanding the global support solution. At this point in time, it is not clear exactly how that's all coming together. There has been significant work done in that space over the recent year, and Australia has actually been at the vanguard of forcing that issue. It's not surprising that when you get problems with the aircraft, people will normally concentrate on the aircraft to the detriment of the support systems and the sustainment system. That would be my experience on the AWC program, on the Collins-class submarine, and equally true on the multi-role tanker transport. And not surprisingly, that's been where a lot of our attention's been diverted on this program. So understanding what that global sustainment solution will look like, where the responsibility and accountability and authority sits between government, the partners as part of that government solution, the industry players, how that will play out for Australia from a regional perspective, what we will be able to do from a regional perspective. We've had the allocation of both the deeper level maintenance and the engines to Australia, and probably for support for at least Korea, the deployed US forces within the region, and potentially Singapore should they come into the program. That's one part of the equation. We're just about to go out now with the RFI, the request for information associated with the component level. That will be very, very significant. And understanding how that plays out with the Australian industry involvement and the ability to actually pull together a sustainment solution here in Australia will be very critical to us understanding what the cost of ownership are. But in doing so, we'll need to balance that out with industry opportunities and also with being able to leverage the scale of the global system. By 2035, we're expecting over 3,100 aircraft to be in the fleet. So we don't want to lose the affordability advantages that come with a large fleet, and we want to gain as much advantage as we possibly can for Australian industry, but we need to do that affordably, for Air Force in the longer term.
So can you just expand a little bit then, this is going to paragraph 65 of your submission to do with sovereignty, and you've talked about having people embedded around the MDFs and that writing of the mission files. Is it your intent to do a similar thing in terms of people in their design assurance branches so that Australia has an informed and competent resource to draw on all the design artefacts so we can make sensible decisions around managing risk from a sovereign perspective? Is that how you're planning to manage that piece?
Yes, it is. So when we're talking about sovereignty, of course, has got a number of different dimensions. It can be sovereign from the perspective of Australian industry outcomes, and what that means for the nation economically. That has been factored into our thinking. The predominant issue for us is how do we maintain direct control over the levers that are critical to generating operational outcomes for Australia. So we're working closely with the Joint Program Office on those things that we will contract for directly, because we have to be able to control those elements because they directly go to generating operational outcomes for Australia. And we're looking at the extent to which we want to be able to do that independently, because that is, has a sovereign dimension for Australia. So deeper level maintenance, the ability to do O+, operational maintenance, backshop type work, the ability to conduct training independently and to be able to control the training outcomes to meet our standards. Those sorts of things are the areas that we're looking at. We regarded the ability to do fast jet engines as being a sovereign requirement. We don't necessarily need to control that directly, but it clearly gives us the opportunity to work with Australian industry, for our fast jet engines. So TAE, who currently have been awarded that, currently support the 404 engine for the Classic Hornet. They support the 414 engine for Super Hornet and Growler. They support the Abrams tank engine, and they will support the F-135 engine. So we see that as important, that we have that capability in Australia, and that would be one that's got an industry dimension to it, not necessarily direct control. So when we talk about sovereign, it's got those multiple dimensions as to the decision making that we've made. We are looking at, when we look at these industry outcomes, how we can get vertical integration, so the grouping of those elements that make sense within a JSF context, and horizontal integration, where we might be able to take advantage of other work that's done here in Australia across other platforms, to get those synergies and to give us that edge in terms of supporting our industry outcomes as well, as an example.
Sure. Can I just take you back to the comment you made about the important focus at the moment of finding and resolving issues, and come back to the issue of engagement in the test and evaluation program? We heard the testimony before from Dr. Joyner saying that his advice to have people deeply involved in that program wasn't taken up. I'm aware from my last visit to Fort Worth that we had a flight test engineer as part of their flight sciences program. You then mentioned two pilots. So you mentioned to the chair there was a test pilot, but then you said there were two pilots who are essentially operating as flying instructors. So do we have three pilots over there, or is the test pilot?
No, we've actually got three pilots in the country at the moment. The test pilot that's actually at Nellis Air Force Base is not flying currently, but we do have a test pilot that is one of our pilots supporting training at Luke Air Force Base. Those people that are at Nellis Air Force Base are actively engaged in the Joint Operational Test Team for the JSF aircraft, and they gain insight across all of the test activity, including residual DT elements as well as OT&E elements, with reach back into the test organisations at Pax River and also for other testing that's been conducted at other bases like Nellis as well as Eglin.
Okay, thanks, Chair.
Senator Whish-Wilson.
Thanks, Chair. I think many of my questions have already been covered by Senator Fawcett and Senator Xenophon. I did want to return to the issue Senator Xenophon raised around the acquisition process becoming defunct back in 2002, when we had we were seeking information from potential tenderers to build a new generation aircraft. I'm interested whether whether there was a full comparison done. Once that information had been received and expressions of interest had come into the department, was there ever a full comparison done, and can we get a copy of that if that was completed? I know it was a long time ago, but
Senator Kim Gillis, I think we're going to have to take that on notice again. It's 14 years ago, so it's a piece of history.
A piece of history, and recently in an ABC interview on background briefing, Mr Gary Bates, who was Air Commodore, Director General of Aerospace Combat Systems in the DMO at the time, his view was that this was never done, and he'd got this information from friends still within the department. But obviously it's quite important in the context of what we've been discussing today around what's been called acquisition malpractice, both in the US and our Canadian witness talked about a similar issue over there. I'll be very interested as to what information we could get from you about the process that was conducted in Australia around comparing and contrasting. Could I also ask whether Department of Defence have ever done a broader cost-benefit assessment of the program since we've entered into it that considers the extent to which the F-35's capabilities or limitations advance our national security? Once again, another issue that the Canadians are currently going through.
Senator AIRMSHL Leigh Davies, I'm not sure I understood your question directly, but if you're asking have we done a cost comparison against if we had in the 2005, 6, 7 timeframe selected a different aircraft type, where would we be in terms of cost versus the ability of that aircraft other than a JSF selected to meet our requirements from here to 2045? Is that?
That's right, yeah.
But the element of that question that I would offer you is that we've done significant work both in Air Force with our coalition partners and those partners in the JSF program, as well as DSTG, Defence Science Technology Group, around what are the national and international, regional world threats that we would want to be well placed to defeat if we're asked to. We basically find ourselves in 3 phases, if I could use that. That is about the here and now through to the early 20s, and the current 4th generation fighters are quite capable. As we go through the 20s, the ability for those aircraft to be effective against an emerging threat, which a number of countries are developing, and that ability to remain competitive and indeed successful on a mission type reduces. By the time we get to 2030 in our extrapolation of the generation of likely threats, that's both airborne and surface-based threats, means that we need an edge. And in our view, during that assessment, the Joint Strike Fighter is the only aircraft available to us that would meet that threat criteria dimension.
So you're confident that, for example, the Russian 5th generation plane we heard about from Air Power this morning is still going to be outclassed by the Joint Strike Fighter?
Senator, we started with bows and arrows and black powder and the like, and it's an evolution. We find a way to be effective that is often countered by a potential enemy. We need to counter that again, and in that sense, as we go through the next 20 or 30 years, there will be evolutions in both design, in propulsion, in weapons, in systems. Our very strong view is that the Joint Strike Fighter is our best insurance policy around maintaining that edge and having the capacity, if you like, to grow the Joint Strike Fighter as that threat emerges.
You mean as in be upgraded?
That's correct.
Upgraded, okay. Just a couple more.
Senator, I just would add there is one study that was pretty critical in this particular evolution. In May 2012, the Government of the Day announced an air combat capability review, and that was due to a number of issues that came out of the rebaselining of the program, budget pressures and schedule issues. And in May 2013, the government announced that that review had been completed, and the conclusion was that they remained committed to the F-35 at that time, and they changed then. At that point in time, they looked at the IOC requirements, and that was a precursor then to government's consideration of the purchase of 58 aircraft in the April 14 time frame. So there is a significant work that was done in that time frame post the rebaselining that then fed into the government's determination in April 14 at JSF, and we would commit to the 58 aircraft.
So it wasn't a captain's pick then, or a captain's call to increase the numbers back in 2014. It was based on a report, information. We heard evidence from ASPI today that the industry component of this was a key factor in the government choosing to go down the Joint Strike Fighter program. Do you agree with that? The fact that the money can be channelled to local contractors and subcontractors?
I think the industry outcomes speak for themselves, and while it's still early days, we're at the point of seeing production ramp up. We're at the knee in the curve. You know, we're currently running at about 4 aircraft per month being produced at Lockheed Fort Worth. You know, over the next 4 years, we're going to be running up to 13 to 14 aircraft being produced each month. That will now flow to Australian industry. So I think the benefits that we're seeing, and arguably the other spillover effects that were discussed earlier today, I think Australian industry has benefited significantly, and I think it was appropriate that that was factored into that determination.
Okay. Couple of quick ones on test reports. I presume we do receive test reports, and what do we do with them when we receive them?
Yes, we do. So our team that sits within the JOT gets access to reports. They review those reports, and any significant issues that we believe need to be addressed by us and inform us as we go into the various fora that we work with the Joint Program Office. They inform our perspective on that. So we are well and truly across a lot of the issues, and if there is an issue that arises, we can quickly gain access to that data. The information we've received about no verified flight simulation, that Senator Xenophon brought up Dr Gilmore's reports. How important is that verification or lack of verification to the Department of Defence? Look, I think we're disappointed too with the VSIM, and we believe that it should have been worked harder. And as I said, it's my view is that I've seen many programs where those key supporting systems are a second thought because people are focusing on the aircraft. That's my experience. We are disappointed with that, but we do see it as critical in the longer term, as I said, for things like mission rehearsal and for the conduct of test and evaluation. However, in the short to medium term, it means that we're going to have to rely on more classical methods of flying the aircraft and conducting it. I can assure you that the aircraft does not just take off and land. We are doing flight test on a regular basis. Our crews that are operating out of Luke Air Force Base are not conducting circuits and not just doing touch and goes. They're actually flying the aircraft and operating the aircraft in a training environment and also getting an understanding of its operational employment.
So along the same theme, in your submission you do allude to the potential risks of concurrence. Is it concerning to you that perhaps without the test data and without the verified simulations there may be deficiencies in the aircraft, and those deficiencies may need to be rectified?
Look, I think concurrency is an issue. It does represent a risk to the program, but I think I would just like to make some comments about our aircraft. So we purchased 2 aircraft out of LRIP 6. There's currently 38 identified upgrades that need to go onto that aircraft. A number of those have already been modified, so page 81 of the DOT and Air report talks about that. It is predicting that for LRIP 9, I believe, they're only predicting that there will be 2 changes to the aircraft as a result of design changes. Our next aircraft will be delivered under LRIP 10, and we'd see that as being quite stable. I've never been on a complex program where even aircraft rolling off the production line are free of having to have modifications, albeit in a small handful. So where we're seeing is the maturity of the program, the nature of the design changes is reducing substantially. Just to make a point about the structural aspects, which would be a significant issue for this program. The F-35A has completed the 2nd life testing, so this is a significant milestone, and it will be starting 3rd life testing within this year, I believe. What that will do is give us confidence that there is no significant structural issues. The nature of where we're going to go in the future with the nature of the changes will not so much be in hardware, it will be in software. And software upgrades to the aircraft are more easily managed than significant hardware changes. So we will see, and as per the DOT&E report, it is highlighting that the software will continue to evolve. That is more easily upgraded on the aircraft than if we had to do major structural changes or major hardware changes.
So are they included in what you classified as sustainment costs earlier when you quoted the $43 billion? Are they include those software changes? Are they included in sustainment costs?
The costs for our aircraft will include, so in the acquisition context, a number of those costs will be addressed in acquisition for the upgrade of the software, but in the longer term, continued upgrades through a block process, the following modernisation program, will have to be addressed by sustainment.
So could you outline where you got the $43 billion? How often are you revising those numbers?
We look at those numbers regularly. Those numbers were independently assessed just recently to support the white paper by PricewaterhouseCoopers, and based on the ground rules and assumptions that we used in our costing model, they said they were pretty accurate. There are a number of ground rules and assumptions in there where we're making, we've factored in some significant issues. As I said before, we're currently estimating that the JSF will cost 39% more than the equivalent fleet of classic Hornets. That to an extent means it's conservative. The areas that concern me for JSF is areas that we haven't traditionally looked at, like what is the intelligence support we need for this aircraft. It's heavily driven by data and knowledge that comes out of the intelligence community. Have we got the right number of people there in those intelligence areas, in the reprogramming areas to support the aircraft? We will have to find out as we go.
How do you quantify those kind of costs? I mean, are they included under life cycle costs or total?
Yeah,
total
we do.
cost?
We make assessments of what that is, but that's based on our assumptions, and what we've got to do is continually assess those assumptions. There is a joint affordability model that's used by the Joint Program Office.
The blueprint.
We're actually using that joint affordability model now to actually modify it to take account of the Australian unique circumstances, the length of the supply chain, how we're going to set up various warehousing and other things, and that will help us refine those costs. But this does take some time. We're early in the bathtub curve, so we're in that learning phase, and what we will do is continually refine that with the aim that we will use that joint affordability model and the cost model that we have today, continually refining that to go back to government post the 2020 timeframe with a new estimate of those through life costs.
Are you able to give us that estimate of through life costs? Is that the $43 billion, or are we talking about a different?
That's $43 billion is our current estimate. On an annual basis, we anticipate back in the 2014 timeframe, when we're looking at that in an escalated context, we estimated that from a sustainment and operational cost for the aircraft, it would cost us about $740 million. Of that $740 million, roughly $340 million were associated with the sustainment of the aircraft.
Okay.
So we have got those models, but they need to be tested and refined over time.
And does that include the logistical support you were talking about earlier, extending runways, all that kind of thing?
Those are covered by acquisition costs. There's currently $1.5 billion worth of infrastructure work associated with the JSF, and that work is for work predominantly at RAF Base Williamtown. I think that's over $800 million going into RAF Base Williamtown from the JSF program in its own right. Roughly $350 million, rough order of magnitude, into RAF Base Tyndall, and the additional money is going to be spent at other forward operating bases and other bases and other facilities around Australia.
Okay. Could I just ask around access to source codes? I know this was quite a controversial issue with previous defence ministers and defence departments with the Hornets and Super Hornets. Is it considered an issue by DOD that we don't have access to the source codes at this point?
AIRMSHL Leigh Davies, Chief Air Force. Senator, the question for me is not around source code. That is outside my area of expertise, but it's about our ability to understand what the system we have can do and our ability to then work with coalition partners to know that our ability to operate with them is effective. So we did have a learning period during the acquisition of Classic Hornet, where it took some time for us to understand what system we had, how we could use it, and how we could integrate with our partners. My level of confidence, given our ability to see inside the program through the folk we've already mentioned to the committee and our access, I have considerably greater confidence that our understanding of what we get with the jet and how we use it, how we can manage it, is substantially better.
So substantially better, as in gives you more flexibility?
More flexibility, more ability to understand what we've got and how we use it.
So what does it, I mean, I presume that not giving access to source code to other countries is a security issue for the US. Is that why these things aren't provided?
Senator, I think that the security issue is a significant factor in there. This aircraft is, 8 million lines of code, or 8.5 million lines of code, I think Jeff Babillon mentioned before. So if you want to maintain the interoperability that the Chief of Air Force just said, you don't want to go changing that, and it is very complex code, and the implications of going in and modifying that in your own right would be quite significant. The issue is when I talk about reprogramming, it's the ability to change the data that initialises the aircraft. The mission data file is far more important than necessarily being able to change the source code that might operate within. That gives you the ability to tailor the data, the intelligence data, so you can get the most effect for the areas of operation that you're going to go into, and potentially is where your warfighting edge might sit.
Okay. Could I just ask in terms of the structure, the contract we've entered into with Lockheed Martin, is it essentially all the issues around sustainment, access to software, upgrades, is it essentially a monopoly provider? I mean, Senator Xenophon talked a bit about competition earlier. Are we locked in with a sole provider, a single contractor, on these issues?
Senator,
I'm just thinking about value for money, like what we pay for these services.
Senator, I don't know that the term locked in and sole provider is the context that I view our ownership of Joint Strike Fighter. ABM Deeble just mentioned that our intent is to not stray. We don't want to become a sole operator of a version of Joint Strike Fighter that we would need to support ourselves. I don't know that we have the capacity to do that. What we are able to do, though, in a management of aircraft fleet is influence the providers to be able to give us value for money, that there are a number of companies around the world that have parts to play in the sustainment, engineering and management of Joint Strike Fighter. It is not a single Lockheed Martin aeroplane, it is a number of companies. And we would, I expect, through our ownership of Joint Strike Fighter and our sustainment, to be able to provide or apply normal value for money improvements in the efficiency and effectiveness of the contracts with those companies, and if somebody's underperforming, to have the option to have someone who performs better.
And is that possible with highly classified software developments, for example, or upgrades on stealth technology, these kind of things? And I understand Lockheed Martin's the expression is a stealth king. They're the ones who have been way ahead of the curve in terms of developing the F-22 and other aircraft before that.
Senator, I think one of the strengths of Air Force's airworthiness system and technical airworthiness system most critically is that we always and we value the relationship of the OEM. It's that design knowledge that becomes critical to sustaining those platforms over time. So I think it would be true to say that I would always see a relationship to the OEM in one way, shape or form. I think if you look at the nature of the companies that are already supporting the aircraft, there is a range of companies that would each offer, the ability to do that. If you look at the 5 big companies that are sit at the Tier 1 level, there's Lockheed Martin, Pratt & Whitney, Rolls-Royce for the engine with Pratt & Whitney. There's also Northrop Grumman and BAE. So there's a range of them that are part of the equation, and there's elements of the supply chain that you may choose to tap into at various points in time. While the aircraft's evolving, though, it will be important to manage that risk and also the technical data and IP issues that come with that to get that better understanding of sustainability.
And Senator, there will be
At that point, the time allotted has elapsed, so we do need to wind up, and then we're going to take a 5-minute break and go in camera. So, Senator Bruce Wilson, you started off by saying that most of your questions have already been asked.
Oh,
so
yes, I found a few more.
we need to wrap it up in the next minute or so.
One more quick question. Could I just ask Mr Gillis to just finish?
I was just saying,
They're not fixed price contracts for these kind of services.
no, but the other aspect of this is that there will be Australian companies that will be exporting and on the vast majority of these platforms around the world. So it's not just a one-way street here. There is an export potential, Australian companies, and we're trying to seek to expand that engagement with Australian industry. So this is not just a one-way process.
I understand that, but I'm trying to think of the taxpayer here and what we're paying for future services to keep this aircraft going.
Senator, that's in the foremost of my mind as well.
I hope it is. I'm sure it is, Mr Gillis. Last question, and most important one to me. If we get to 2018 where we get delivery, and then 2020 and these aircraft aren't operational, there's still additional hitches, and you'd have to say past history suggests that's a possibility, if not a probability. At what point do you make a decision that we need to fill that gap, or when will you let Parliament know? When will a crunch time come for you, or a fork in the road, when you need to make a judgment on this?
Senator AIRMSHL Davies, we will continue to get the DOTE reports. We'll continue to get feedback from those folk who are embedded in the program. As we increase our numbers of pilots and maintainers, of engineers and sustainers, we'll begin to build that picture. But what I would offer you in answer is I'll take the aeroplane next year as it comes, and it will still outplay for the scenarios that we want to have our fighter aircraft play in over the Classic Hornet.
Even if it can be hacked?
We need to be vigilant against cyber threats, not just with the Joint Strike Fighter, but with our mobile communication devices and with Australian industry across the spectrum. That we are vigilant against cyber threat for the JSF, for the Super Hornet, for the Growler, for the P8, for the Triton, for all of those. This is a defence issue, and one which we are serious about tackling. I don't see the JSF being singly different in that regard.
Thank you.
All right, thank you very much. We will, the date for return of answers to questions on notice has been set at the 19th of April. We will now thank you very much for your evidence. We'll now take a short 5-minute break before resuming with a private session.